Ladies and gentlemen, by the time you see this, it's 6 o'clock in London, it's 1 p.m. in New York, it's 1 a.m. in Hong Kong, 3 a.m. in Sydney, 10 a.m. in San Francisco, and 10:30 at night in Mumbai. Greetings, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are in the world today. My name is Patrick L. Young, the IPO-VID live stream, Series 16, Episode 2. For those of you who are good at your 6 times table, that's episode 92 starts here. Today, ladies and gentlemen, we have a fantastic guest, Alina Aldambergen. She's making the case for Kazakhstan. Alina is the CEO of the Kazakhstan Stock Exchange and chairman of the KASE Clearing Center. Alina sits on the board of FEAS, the Federation of Euro-Asian Stock Exchanges, whose conference I was delighted to keynote at before COVID in Abu Dhabi, in fact. And she is an advisory board member of the Association of Financiers of Kazakhstan. Greetings, Alina. Lovely to see you today. Where in the world are you?
Good evening, Patrick. Thank you for inviting me to your program. I'm glad to participate here and have an opportunity to have a discussion with you. Talking about myself, I'm here in Almaty, Kazakhstan, ready to answer your questions.
Looking forward to it. Almaty in Kazakhstan, not a city I have ever visited. Hopefully we'll manage to rectify that at some stage in the future. Looks quite sensational. When I was sitting yesterday booking a ticket on Turkish Airlines, and there were all the wonders of the world you must discover, and in the middle they showed us a picture of Almaty from a magnificent drone. Looks sensational. So, Alina, tell me, you're now the chief executive of the Kazakhstan Stock Exchange. We'll go back and talk about KASE in a minute, but tell me a little bit about your background. How did you get into the stock exchange business?
Thank you. I'm here with Kazakhstan Stock Exchange already for 7 years. I'm chairwoman of the management board, executive board. I worked for KASE since 2003. I was on the board of directors. It's basically the board of directors. It's not executive, but like supervisory board for Kazakhstan Stock Exchange. I was a representative of different financial institutions where I worked before, and also I worked for the regulator, so I had a guaranteed seat on the board of directors. So I'm involved with capital markets for a long time in my career already.
So you have a lengthy experience in capital markets. You were on the supervisory board for a number of years. What drove you? What did you see was the opportunity to go to the executive side of the Kazakhstan Stock Exchange?
Talking about Kazakhstan, a number of years ago, we celebrated the 30th anniversary of independence. And in 1991, the Soviet Union broke down, and we moved from planned economy to the market economy. And since then, we established new financial institutions, and we set up the new infrastructure, adopted new laws. So therefore, the market gradually developed, and we introduced different financial instruments, different financial institutions. And I think that Kazakhstan was quite successful in that.
Very interesting. So Kazakhstan, obviously in the development to a market economy, I mean, quite an epic period of time. So tell me, when was the Kazakhstan Stock Exchange actually founded?
The Kazakhstan Stock Exchange was established in 1993. So this year we're going to celebrate our 30th anniversary. We actually started with FX trading. Trading dollar tenge as a first currency, and then we have the ruble tenge added and yuan tenge. This is the currencies that they use in Kazakhstan for export-import operations. And then we gradually introduced different securities. For example, we started with state securities, then we had the local shares issued, and then the bond market developed.
So that's very interesting, because your path then actually very, very similar to Moscow, because if I remember correctly, the original MICEX and RTS really started by trading foreign exchange in order to manage to facilitate markets.
Yes, I think exactly, because as the market developed, the first thing you need is a foreign currency to allow your import and export operations. But then again, you introduce gradually different types of securities to fund your activities, whether capital or whether it's borrowing in the capital markets. Plus, in Kazakhstan, we established like several pillars of the financial system. So we had the joint stock companies law, we had the regulation on securities markets, then we had different financial institutions. In 1998, we launched pension fund system. The pension fund system accounts right now for $32 billion in assets. Then we had insurance market and life insurance companies also growing up. Besides the banking sector, the brokerage sector, asset management companies. And therefore today at Kazakhstan Stock Exchange, we have all types of securities being traded except maybe digital. And this is something that we're going to work on going forward.
Really interesting. So you've got a complete suite of, let's call it cash market traded products. What about the derivatives market? Have you looked into that?
Yes, we launched futures. We have FX futures and futures on different shares, but this market is less developed as we are still lacking the liquidity on some of the underlying instruments.
Very interesting. And do you think that's because it's just a growing pain in Kazakhstan, or is it an issue related to, for example, the currency that the futures are denominated in?
I think we need a deeper market, both for FX and shares. And also, I think one of the specifics of Kazakhstan that the economy is quite large and we have a number of large companies and they prefer to do IPOs in international markets. That's why in Kazakhstan, we mostly have dual trading of the shares that were listed initially in London Stock Exchange, for example. Therefore, the liquidity is mostly in international markets. But I hope this trend will change because we had just recently had fully local IPO of Kazakh gas in Kazakhstan.
Now that's a fantastic story, isn't it? Because yes, you were saying, and we're discussing making the case for Kazakhstan with the chief executive of the Kazakhstan Stock Exchange this evening, Alina Aldambergen. I mean, Alina, it's very interesting because you mentioned the fact that obviously London, actually the London Stock Exchange specifically has done very well out of Kazakhstani IPOs because a lot of large energy companies went and listed there. So you had this one major IPO last year. Tell me a bit about that. It must have been a very, very exciting process.
Yes, we have a privatization company going on in Kazakhstan, and that's for quasi-state sector because we have quite a large sector which belongs to the state. It would be different companies like oil and gas exploration, oil and gas transportation, electricity grid operation, and so on. And so these companies, they issue part of the shares to increase and improve corporate governance, establish more prudent dividend policies, and also allow local investors to participate. So last year, the government decided to sell the stake in Kazakh Gas, which is an oil and gas exploration and production company. It also has a shareholder of transportation company. And given the situation in the international markets, it was decided that IPO will be done locally. We also have a growing retail base, and 50% of the shares were bought by retail investors.
So that's a very interesting percentage. Run me through that again. How much of it roughly do you think was bought by retail investors?
So they raised around $330 million, and around 47% were bought by retail investors. That was around 70,000 people. And 47 were bought by legal entities, institutional investors mostly. It could be pension funds, life insurance companies, and the legal entities in general, brokerage companies. And then around 4% were bought by international participants.
Those are phenomenal numbers, if I may say so. I mean, it's very interesting because you mentioned earlier you've got this $32 billion, for want of a better term, wall of money from the pension funds, which is fantastic. And obviously you've got other institutional investors, but seeing such lively interest from retail investors is obviously very, very good for the market.
Yes, I think it's a good opportunity for retail investors to participate. And actually we have a growing investor base. We have around 1 million accounts of individuals opened through a local CSD. But they also invest quite significantly in international shares because we don't have sufficient local instruments. They buy local bonds, shares predominantly, international shares, and some of them invest in crypto as well.
Okay, that's very interesting. So those international shares, are the retail investors able to hold those at the local CSD?
Of course, there are different ways how they buy international shares. It could be mostly with international brokers or with local brokers, but we also at KASE open the market to trade around 50 international stocks because we see the growing interest and we try to bring the stocks to the market and increase liquidity locally. Brokers support this market so that the investors can participate through the stock exchange.
That's very, very interesting. That's incredible also. I mean, the number that you just threw in there, 1 million people holding accounts. Roughly, remind me, sorry, what is the population of Kazakhstan?
It's around 20 million, to be precise, 19.6 million people.
That's that's a stunning number, because if you think about it, the population of Kazakhstan then is about the same as the population of Romania. And I mean, Romania has trouble filling a top-class football stadium with all of their retail investors. I mean, the last time I looked a couple of years ago, it was about 70,000 people. You had 70,000 investors in one IPO alone, which is quite a sensational number. So that really shows a very, very vibrant possibility for the exchange going forward. So after this IPO, presumably there are other government entities that are likely to be privatized in the, maybe not short term, but at least in the medium to long term?
Yes, we expect a number of companies to go to the market, but of course it depends on the decisions of their stakeholders, either the Samruk of Kazanah holding or the government. But one of the IPOs that are being discussed right now is the IPO of our local airline, Air Astana, which is actually a regional airline. And they basically has flights in the region, international flights, and in Kazakhstan is quite significant.
Yes, I mean, Air Astana has a very significant footprint. I do believe it flies all the way to London, and it flies to multiple different cities around the world intercontinentally, as well as you say, in the region of the different, for want of a better term, the different stands are surrounding Kazakhstan. That would certainly be an interesting IPO. So your content at the moment, roughly how many shares do you have actually listed on the exchange, and roughly how much government debt?
In terms of market capitalization, the market capitalization of all shares which are listed is around $30 billion. It's around 90 companies, but not all of the 90 companies are quite liquid. So we have around 20 liquid stocks, and 9 of them will be in the KASE index.
Very good. So the KASE index, which gives you your top 20 shares, essentially, I mean, everybody has the same issue. It's a kind of Pareto principle, 80-20. So you've got roughly 20%, 30% of your companies that are doing the vast bulk of your trading. How does the market actually work? You run on an electronic system, brokers, dealers, etc.?
We have a universal exchange. So we actually run 3 trading systems for 4 markets. For derivatives, we have a separate system. For money markets and securities, we have another trading system, and FX market, another trading system. We have 3 trading systems. We actually have a cooperation with Moscow Stock Exchange. So we bought 3 systems from them since they've been doing a lot of upgrade. They had a significant participation also of retail investors or foreign investors before some, of course, of certain events started, basically. Therefore, 3 trading systems. We run CCP. We allow T+2 trading for 230 instruments. In general, we have 1,500 instruments traded in the stock exchange. But as I mentioned, it's basically universal exchange. So we have several markets.
Very interesting. A universal exchange model, and then you're running your own CCP clearinghouse, and also you've got the CSD as well.
Yes, we own part of CSD, but CSD is a monopoly in Kazakhstan, so it's predominantly owned by central bank. But okay. CSD services our securities markets.
Right. Okay. So I just wasn't sure on that. My apologies. So the CSD is owned by the central bank, and you're essentially a part shareholder therein. So that's a very, very interesting suite of comprehensive products. And you mentioned the MOEX, Moscow Exchange is giving you the technology. Fabulous technology, it has to be said. I mean, actually genuinely designed and developed by rocket scientists, of whom there are more than a few in Kazakhstan as well, I do believe. it's an incredible piece of technology, and as you say, developed for universal exchanges across all sorts of business. Can you explain to me a little bit about how your money market works, please?
In money market, basically, you can use either FX to do swap operations, and swap operations are used both for hedging reasons, but also to get liquidity in certain currency. We also have a huge repo market, and repo market amounts for majority of our transactions, and I would say not in number, but in volume. So daily turnover at the stock exchange is around $2 billion.
Wow, that's a serious number. So the repo market, then, you're trading that within the exchange's platform or one of the platforms, and then it goes to be cleared in the clearinghouse in the CCP?
Yes, majority of our repo transactions is CCP clearable. All transactions are netted, therefore they all go through CCP, but only some of them are run on T+ basis. Because for T+ basis, of course, we guarantee execution of transactions, and they also traded in T+2 regime.
Very interesting. So in essence, I mean, the business you have there is really quite similar to, for example, BIST, the Bursa Istanbul, where actually a lot of people think that their securities, their stock market is the biggest part of the business, but in fact their repo business is by far the largest revenue element on their bottom line. And actually a great thing, because explain to us a little bit about the color behind that. Are there many banks in Kazakhstan, or is it a sort of an oligopoly of big national banks like, say, the UK or the USA?
I think that the history of exchanges like which are 30 years old, like CIS exchanges, us or Russian exchanges, because we were set up quite recently, and therefore there is of course economies of scale. So the more instruments you trade, the better is for institutions. In Kazakhstan specifically, all transactions were brought to the exchange because it makes it more efficient, and also for transparency reasons, for price discovery reasons, for liquidity, and therefore institutional investors and basically our intermediaries, banks and brokers are used to do everything through a stock exchange. And therefore, to service them better, basically, we allow them netting access to different markets, transfer funds between markets. And I think the last step, which is basically remaining, is to make universal collateral for all markets. That's what they want as well. To use, for example, different securities as a collateral for FX market or for derivatives markets.
Very interesting. And of course, that's one of the great key aspects to central counterparty clearing, because if you can bring everything in a unified basis, such as we saw, for example, in recent years in Brazil, where the B3 brought together the bond market, it brought together the stock exchanges of Sao Paulo and also of Rio de Janeiro, and created an incredible netting and collateral benefit for all the underlying parties, which is obviously very, very advantageous for the market as a whole. So it's intriguing. You've got this universal exchange. You're sitting in a very, very interesting region in the steppes. The economy itself, just give us a little bit of an idea. What are the major sectors of the Kazakhstan economy, Alina?
GDP of Kazakhstan is around $230 billion. We have quite significant export-import balance. Of course, we are export positive. We are exporting oil and gas and oil and gas related products. It's around 50% of our exports. And we also export a lot of different metals and minerals. So basically, we are dependent to some extent on the GDP growing in different countries, on demand for minerals and oil and gas. But of course, we are trying also to diversify the economy. Our agricultural sector, construction sector, transportation sector is also basically giving value to our GDP.
Very interesting. So you've really got an incredibly rich and fertile economy, thanks to being driven by the minerals, the metals, the oil, the gas that's under there, and also a strong base in agriculture. And presumably, I mean, as you grow, are you seeing a large change in, for example, things like tourism? Is that starting to really take off after 30 years after the Iron Curtain fell?
Yes, we're also trying to develop the service industry, to increase education, to bring in more IT specialists. different other sectors of the economy are also growing. Trade is significant because we do a lot of export and import, not only of oil and gas and minerals, but we also import a lot of machinery, goods, and so on. But this is basically the natural advantages of Kazakhstan, and we also need to make it more service-oriented, to modernize the economy. And this is something that we are working on.
Yes, it's quite a colossal economy altogether, and obviously a significant population, 20 million people. It really gives you an economy of scale across the economy itself, which is very significant. So when you look at the exchange itself, what are your biggest challenges when you're sitting in the hot seat as chief executive of the Kazakhstan Stock Exchange?
I think in terms of the depth of instruments, breadth of instruments, we covered everything because we trade all types of securities. It could be ETFs, investment funds, shares, bonds, whatever is issued in Kazakhstan and whatever is issued by Kazakhstan issuers abroad, because our investors also like to buy Eurobonds, GDRs, and we also trade and settle them in foreign currencies. We also launched, as I mentioned before we were trading Russian securities, for example. We launched American shares trading, so trying to develop this market. Of course, there are certain disadvantages to international infrastructure, but this is something that our investors are looking into. In terms of the market infrastructure, for traditional exchange, basically doing everything possible, developing CCP. This year project will be separating CCP, getting international ratings, basically compliant with international regulations. So to allow for international investors to participate in Kazakhstan directly, this is a possibility that exists. But since majority of our instruments also traded internationally, therefore they prefer to do it via international OTC markets or London Stock Exchange so far.
Okay, that's quite understandable, and certainly the being credibly accredited by the international authorities gives you a huge advantage, particularly in the CCP market, because people will feel much more comfortable about holding collateral there. But I got to take you back a step, because this actually is around about the story of how we met, because I was always fascinated, and I've used it in presentations for many years until you happened to see me giving a presentation to that effect at FEAS in Abu Dhabi a number of years ago. And I mean, the Russian exchange in Moscow and also your exchange in Kazakhstan were trailblazers, because you came out with T+0 settlement many years ago, long before it was even being discussed credibly in the West as a possibility, and it's still a long, long way away from happening. Tell us a little bit about how you managed to work your way towards achieving T+0 settlement.
Yeah, it's always a discussion internally, because since our market is predominantly domestic and all domestic financial institutions, they used to have everything settled within T0. Therefore, they're always complaining, why do we need T+2? Well, we introduced T+2 in order to basically to increase liquidity in the markets, to allow international investors to participate in the market, given the time difference, because we are ahead of London or New York. Therefore, if we want to increase liquidity and bring international investors, we need basically to expand trading hours and to allow for settlement. T+2 is basically the time which allows if international investors will participate. But since the participation is still under 10-20%, so basically we also run some T0 markets for local participants for immediate liquidity reasons.
That's very interesting, and I think a fascinating reflection on what you mentioned earlier, which was thanks to the transition out of the command economy under the Soviet Union, there was this opportunity to build all new technology, and the whole banking system, therefore, in Kazakhstan is effectively remarkably more modern than a lot of its Western counterparts that are still stuck on systems that even rely on old-fashioned computer punch cards until recently, but they've been gradually driving those systems to try and move them forward. So you've been there, you've come back to T+2 because it helps obviously with international investors and tries to move things forward. What is it like trying to market the Kazakhstan exchange overseas? I mean, is it a different process when you're dealing with, say, the neighbors, or when you're dealing with maybe the UAE, as opposed to when you go to, I don't know, London or New York?
I think that we do not do so active marketing because, as I mentioned, a lot of our issues are not abroad because they issue Eurobonds. Those companies, banks or companies which can issue Eurobonds actually tap that market. But for us, in order to market or to present our market, for example, to stock market investors, we need to increase issuance domestically. This is one of the things that we are working also to improve our ratings in FTSE MCI to become emerging market, because by different infrastructure basically factors we are in emerging market, but we are just lacking truly liquid shares in Kazakhstan which have done IPO, and that depends of course on the demand or by our issuers, because they still prefer to do and raise financing either by issuing bonds or through bank loans. But some of the markets we are marketing, like for example, state securities, we are doing together with National Bank and the Ministry of Finance. We have direct link with Clearstream, and right now establishing a link with Euroclear so that international participants can trade both OTC, those instruments, and domestically if they want to sell them in the stock exchange. But of course, it's more popular for them to trade it in Clearstream and Euroclear or through Bloomberg.
Yes, obviously there's that big international line, particularly for organizations that are in, say, Western Europe and the United States of America, that they're going to feel comfortable with the idea of using Clearstream at all points in time, and fundamentally Euroclear when you get there in the future when you join there. So looking at your exchange, I mean, it's come an incredibly long way as you celebrate your 30th anniversary. What do you think are the highlights of what has been achieved by the exchange, and both by you as CEO during that time?
Thank you for the question. I will return to that question, but I also wanted to mention that one of the advantages of Kazakhstan that we have quite strong institutional base. We have a lot of different funds. We have big pension fund. We have a lot of state funds, and therefore, actually, maybe we do not really need investors in some markets. But what we do, we want to have a variety of investors, and that's what we are working on. Talking about our 30-year achievement, I think we went through a long path, and as I mentioned, we are trading all types of securities. We only didn't develop commodity business because it's still under-regulated. We launched CCP. I'm looking forward that we'll be able to convince different issues to do local IPOs. And bring more international investors, because it will be something more interesting to trade, which is not available in international markets.
That's very interesting. So trying to develop some product that are not available into international markets. Can you give us an example, or is it all top secret?
I think what I mentioned is, for example, if you want to buy some Ministry of Finance bonds, you have the Eurobonds. If you want to buy local bonds, then local bonds are also available already to trade in various international jurisdictions. But also you can do it in the stock exchange through either local brokerage or doing direct link to KASE. We have also possibility to establish and become a member of KASE. For shares, we're interested, and we have some regional investors and brokers participating in KASE directly. And of course, we're interested in international brokers to participate directly and trade locally. But we need to increase the basically volume, the depth of the market, bring more international or more interesting issues to the market.
Very interesting. So in terms of adding those more issues, those more issuers and content, how were you, for example, what's the situation at the moment with SMEs and small enterprises? Are you seeing interest in them coming to the market, or is it still a little premature?
I think we have a number of medium-sized companies that could come to the market, but they still either in the growing stage or prefer to keep it private. So it's not like we have a lot of private business going publicly to the market. But we are working with them. We explain how it works. We do a lot of actually financial literacy programs.
Mm-hmm. So you do a lot of financial literacy programs with the companies, with these possible issuers. Is this a kind of traditional, if I may say so, sort of family business thing? I mean, we get that sort of situation arises in Malta, it arises in Australia, it arises in all sorts of economies where a lot of family businesses just don't want to relinquish control or grow the pie.
I think family business is something new developed in Kazakhstan since we just moved to market economy. So it's like we're coming to second generation of entrepreneurs. It's more like they prefer to have a lot of debt financing, and if they increase shares, they do it basically themselves. But what we see is a new trend among younger population. Those entrepreneurs of 20s to 30s, they like to establish the business, develop it, and then sell it, either privately or in the public. And there are a lot of private transactions going on. So what we are working on to maybe tap this kind of companies to come to stock exchange.
Very interesting. And of course, the more dynamic the economy, the more opportunity you have in that direction, which becomes very, very interesting. So when you're looking at the possible areas of companies coming to market, you mentioned a lot of companies are coming to market and issuing a lot of debt. Do they issue that debt just in local tenge, or do they issue it also in, say, US dollars or other currencies?
Actually, in terms of debt issuance, it's also more large companies or medium-sized companies or financial institutions. We also yet to convince SMEs to come to the market. SMEs prefer to have direct loans with banks. One of the reasons why companies do not like to come to the exchange, and one of the reasons when they come to the exchange, they want to become transparent or they do not want to become transparent. Plus, we have quite strict regulations about joint stock companies law, corporate governance, disclosure of corporate information, and therefore some companies do not have such kind of infrastructure or preference to become public.
Right, and those are actually issues that we have in all markets around the world, particularly the one about transparency, which can be a major issue for particularly smaller and medium businesses who don't like that idea, depending on their growth path or their management approach. It's a fascinating situation altogether when you're looking at the pie, because it strikes me that you just have an incredible number of opportunities. It's obviously quite difficult because all of them are going to take some work to manage to reach maturity.
I think, yes, basically, as we say, financial sector may be ahead of the corporate sector. So we have the possibilities, but the corporate sector doesn't use it. It's only those which are already transparent, large, sizable, and do not be obliged by law, for example, to be joint stock companies or maintain corporate governance. It's usually financial institutions and large corporates, especially with state ownership. They go to the market basically and raise financing.
Right. And indeed, obviously, if you're in minerals and exploration and metals and so on, they have, once you start exploring, it's a bottomless pit, both in terms of what you dig and the amount of money that it costs you. So they're very likely to be coming to the market to raise money. But as you mentioned, some of the very large ones will also go to London and do stuff there.
I think another issue that since we have quite a strong institutional base and it's regulated, quite strictly regulated, so they have kind of limitations what they buy. Usually it's like we have investment grade ratings, could be a few notches below, but not really SME type of rating. And most of the SMEs also don't have a rating. That's the issue.
Of course. So that's quite conventional the world over. SMEs won't have a rating. But obviously it is very interesting, the point you make quite clearly. I mean, $32 billion in pension fund assets and a strong private investment sector of institutions that are able to invest gives Kazakhstan a huge opportunity. Do you think that possibly lends to, are there other countries in the region that might have less capital that you can see companies or bonds being issued from those countries from their corporates?
Yes, our institutional investors also investing quite heavily in a regional and international markets because they don't have sufficient instruments locally, so they invest in abroad as well. And sometimes for liquidity management, sometimes for like active management of their assets. And in terms of assets, it's up to $50 billion that we have institutional investors' money in Kazakhstan.
That's a serious amount of money. So that's $50 billion, of which roughly 32 billion is the pension fund assets, and then there's another sort of $18 billion of assets on top.
Yes, because we have insurance companies, they have reserve requirements. Life insurance is growing because the pension system is getting mature. Banks have quite significant liquidity. So all of this is being invested either in domestic market or international markets.
That's very interesting. And just give us a little bit of a flavor. The local currency, the tenge, what's the sort of, I mean, presumably that's a little bit more like, say, the ruble or other currencies in the region. So I would imagine it has had a tradition of yielding relatively high amounts. Am I correct?
Also, devaluation factor is also kind of common for tenge because of the volatility of the economy, dependence on the mineral and oil and gas prices. So we have some risks of devaluation. That's why investors also prefer to keep some assets in local currency or international currencies. And that's international drives basically international securities management.
Okay, I see, that's quite simple. And then it's relatively easy, is it, within the local banking system and within your CSD and so on, or CCP, to have balances in foreign currency like US dollars as well as in the local tenge?
Yes, I actually sometimes when we have a Eurobond issue by a local issuer, it could be up to 50% will be bought by local investors.
Wow. That's a
Quite,
very
so therefore, Eurobonds usually perform quite well, and GDRs are well supported as well by domestic base.
Very good. That's very, very interesting that the domestic base is so strong. And as you've been saying, such a strong retail base as well, which is obviously very, very important. Is the retail base tending to buy and hold for a long time, or is it quite speculative and turning over its stock with considerable velocity?
I mentioned that we have about 1 million accounts, but it's not that all million accounts are being trading. I mean, and the growth we have achieved it over the 3-year period because of digitalization, popularity of stock markets, and they were growing during pandemic. So a lot of investors were switching to stock market. But actually, we have, during the months, maybe around 3,000 accounts trading, and over the year, like 40,000 accounts trading. So it's also varies. Some of the investors buy and hold shares, for example, for dividend reasons. Some of them are more active traders. But if we talk about the stock market, about 50% of the secondary market is retail trading.
Wow, 50% of the secondary market and the stock market being retail trading. That's very interesting. And actually, just to go back to the stock market, the mechanics, is it a central limit order book, a market maker system? How does the trading actually work?
It's market maker system. Usually for liquid shares, we have market makers. And also for to be eligible for T+2 and CCP, you have to have market makers and liquidity providers.
Okay, so therefore there's a reasonable amount of liquidity induced. But again, you're saying that the market making provision is pretty much all coming from the local Kazakhstan economy.
Yeah, it's local market makers.
Local market makers. That's very, very interesting altogether. So, I mean, what would you like to see being the next step developments that you're hoping to bring forward, Alina?
Naturally, we are looking from time to time to commodity markets, either launching futures on commodity or in general establishing commodity business. But since it's a little bit under-regulated and it doesn't fall under regulation of the financial regulator, there's still big competition. We're just looking at it. Once we see that there is basically establishing a more transparent market with certain rules that we can bring to the stock exchange, we'll be looking at that market. We are also looking into digital instruments and launching some instruments which are either backed by digital, potentially cryptocurrency despite the crypto winter that we are observing, but also basically setting up the infrastructure for digital instruments. I think this is something that we need to deal with going forward.
It's very interesting in terms of the way you're looking to step forward, and certainly there was a very good AFM conference last week in Dubai, which was trying to discuss how legacy exchanges can look at the digital asset world, because yes, you're right, it's crypto winter. At the same time, as I was remarking at that point during my keynote speech, I think it's actually a great time for legacy exchanges because the cryptocurrency industry itself has somewhat discredited its image in so many ways. And I think people trust the established legacy exchange world. So it gives a great opportunity going forward for digital assets to be traded in an interesting fashion from the existing exchanges. And we're here talking about making the case for Kazakhstan. That's the Kazakhstan Stock Exchange with the CEO, Alina Aldambergen. And it's been really, really fascinating, Alina. I mean, you've listed so many fascinating numbers for me. I mean, 70 million, no, I've got my
32 billion pension funds.
50 billion in pension funds, 50 billion in total assets. Thank you very, very much. You've got a 20 million person population. You've just had a fascinating IPO that raised $300 million. And in fact, it was incredible to see almost half of the offer being taken up by retail investors. You've got something like 40% of your daily stock market turnover going through the retail investors. You've got this huge Eurobond business and related bond and debt issuance, which is actually also being cleared at Clearstream and gives you a huge amount of opportunity, as well as the futures derivative side that you're building out and a really pulsating repo market, very, very similar to the success that we've seen in, for example, Istanbul Stock Exchange in Turkey. It's an amazing holistic vision of the whole economy that we're seeing going through your exchange. And I suppose that raises to me, the obvious question that I always like to ask at this time, Alina, where do you see the capital market revolution going next?
I actually follow this topic quite closely, and an interesting discussion was in WFE last September, because we'll follow the digital infrastructure. I think this is something that we'll have to work on going forward, because digital technologies are exactly disruptive. And we see that, for example, we work with retail investors via our financial literacy programs. But one, for example, our competitor locally, they even launched a specific trading platform, being the stock exchange. So they have a subsidiary. So this is something we have to understand, whether the intermediates would disappear, whether the stock exchange has to go in the intermediation. And especially for digital infrastructure, we see that some exchanges actually setting up this kind of brokers, and they're setting up custody business. So this is a bit different approach, different regulations, and the white paper is being established in Europe. So we need to understand how the digital technologies will drive this market. Because we are dealing wholesale, so we're talking to banks and brokers, but if we have to talk to retail and offer them services, this is changing our model of business.
So a changing model of business, lots of exciting opportunities, those pulsating 70,000 retail investors who took part in your IPO just recently, the possibilities of more privatization, the repo market that I mentioned earlier, the CCP and the opportunity to develop greater derivatives products, both across foreign exchange and so on. Looking out slightly further, there's the opportunity from the commodity derivatives market and the commodities market per se, as that comes more onto the auspices of regulation in the financial market. You've got this huge possibility from the stock market itself related to the bond market. Gosh, you've made the case for Kazakhstan absolutely brilliantly and very eloquently today, Alina Aldambergen. It's been a joy to have you on the IPO-VID number 92. We are approaching our century. Exciting times for us as well. Certainly, you've made the case brilliantly for Kazakhstan. Alina Aldambergen, I thank you very, very much for your time today. This has been IPO-VID 92, coming to you live from Malta and indeed the beating heart capital of Kazakhstan, Almaty, and the Kazakhstan Stock Exchange. Thanks for watching. Have a great week in blockchain.